Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This matters more than it should, because time, where you are in it, has always been central to how cults hide. They survive not by staying active, but by letting the world forget they were ever real. And some of them never needed to be remembered in the first place. They simply waited. Tonight's investigation is not about fiction. It's about the real-world beliefs that fed Lovecraft's imagination, and may still be feeding something older than imagination itself. The hidden rituals, the coastal disappearances, the languages without roots, none of it was invented whole cloth. Much of it came from the world around him. Some of it, disturbingly, still does. We'll examine the historical cults that inspired Lovecraft's stories, not as curiosities, but as structures, who they were, what they believed, why they remain so effective at not being found. We'll follow a trail across anthropology, literature, and philosophy, tracking how myth bleeds into method. You're already part of the ritual. Just by listening, you're invoking something people have tried very hard to forget. And if some part of you feels like we shouldn't be doing this, good. That means you're paying attention. When Howard Phillips Lovecraft began writing in the early 20th century, he wasn't inventing cults from nothing. He was translating a cultural anxiety already deeply rooted in his surroundings. His stories emerged from a precise historical moment, post-Victorian, post-faith, and on the edge of modernity. It was a period when old belief systems were collapsing, but their structures remained. Lovecraft's cults reflect that residue, not as faiths, but as survivals. New England, Lovecraft's home and creative epicenter, was itself a landscape of buried beliefs. The Puritan legacy, long decayed into rigid moralism, still whispered of witch trials and invisible forces. The ruins of that theological certainty surrounded Lovecraft. Abandoned churches, forgotten cemeteries, and tight-lipped towns where secrets seemed inherited. More than aesthetic inspiration, these became models for how beliefs could go underground without dying. His cults did not exist in contrast to civilization. They grew beneath it. Consider 1920s America. The nation was publicly celebrating rational progress, radio, airplanes, industrial growth, while privately obsessed with what science could not explain. Spiritualism was booming. Seances were held in upper-class parlors. Mediums claimed to speak to the dead. The Theosophical Society promised hidden knowledge passed down from older, non-Western masters. Lovecraft dismissed these movements as foolish, but he studied their structures. He understood their appeal. They offered access to meaning in a world rapidly losing its gods. In that way, he shared their question, if not their answer. This is crucial. Lovecraft did not believe in the supernatural, but he was haunted by what belief could do. He saw cults not as mystical orders, but as collective psychological phenomena, systems where humans became conduits for something outside themselves. Not divine, not demonic, simply other. This is why his fictional cults resist definition. They are not religions in the classical sense. They are vessels for something ancient and indifferent, often pre-linguistic, sometimes pre-human, and they endure not because they work, but because they refuse to go away. In his letters, Lovecraft frequently mocked religious thought, yet he returned again and again to stories about people who organized their lives around unspeakable truths. This contradiction reveals something important. His cults are not objects of belief. They are reactions to it. Where Christian salvation offered comfort, Lovecraft's cosmos offered vast, uncaring intelligence. The cultist does not worship for protection. He worships because he has no other choice. We must also consider Lovecraft's academic effect. His narrators are almost always scholars, anthropologists, folklorists, or scientists, people trained to observe but not participate. This framing makes his cults feel real, even when their rituals are invented. In The Call of Cthulhu, for example, the story unfolds as a research file, compiled from police records, newspaper clippings, and journal entries. The result is an illusion of ethnographic fact. The cult becomes a field report, not a fantasy. This technique was not accidental. Lovecraft borrowed it from 19th century anthropologists who documented tribal religions with a mix of curiosity and condescension. He understood the power of the scholarly tone, and he used it to make the unthinkable feel quietly inevitable. It's easy to overlook how carefully he blurred fiction and reality. His fictional texts, like the Necronomicon, are described with the same tone as real grimoires. His invented cults are placed in real locations: Louisiana, the Pacific Islands, the Massachusetts coast, each chosen not for their exoticism, but for their historical layers. These were places shaped by colonial violence, cultural suppression, and maritime myth. They already held stories that could not be verified, but would not die. Lovecraft simply added a new layer. The key insight here is not that Lovecraft based his cults on real ones. It's that he understood how real cults functioned. Their secrecy was structural, not thematic. Their rituals were repetitive, not symbolic. Their survival depended not on popularity, but on being dismissed. In this light, the most Lovecraftian element of his cults is not their worship of cosmic entities. It is their capacity to endure beneath notice. Historical records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show a surprising number of small, secretive spiritual movements across North America. Many were syncretic, combining elements of Christianity, Eastern mysticism, and indigenous traditions. Some met in basements, others in forests. Most left little documentation, but newspaper clippings and police reports hint at their presence. Lovecraft was aware of these undercurrents. He read fringe publications. He followed occult scandals. He watched, as a scholar might, how irrational belief adapted to modern life. This brings us to his core creative intent. Lovecraft didn't write about cults because they were frightening. He wrote about them because they made sense within his worldview. If the universe is vast, cold, and unknowable, then any belief system that claims comprehension must either be delusional or terrifyingly correct. The cultist, in this framework, is not an outsider. He is a test case. Lovecraft never claimed his cults were real, but he built them from real fears, real behaviors, and real methods of concealment. That is why they linger, not as fictional monsters, but as plausible artifacts. When you read his work closely, the question shifts. It's no longer, did he invent them? It becomes, why do they feel like they've always been here? And more disturbingly, who kept them alive? Long before Lovecraft, the Western imagination had already constructed a framework for hidden cults, often without calling them that. Heresies, mystery religions, demonologies, and primitive traditions were treated less as belief systems and more as residues of something older, darker, and incompatible with progress. This interpretive lens became a foundation Lovecraft would inherit, adapt, and weaponize. We begin with Protestantism, not for its theology, but for its obsession with deviation. In post-Reformation Europe, heresy was more than a sin. It was evidence of spiritual contamination, something that could spread, if not rooted out. The Protestant imagination, particularly in Puritan New England, developed a specific fear that false beliefs could survive underground, pass through families or hidden communities. These ideas took root in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, where a mixture of superstition, Puritan anxiety, and unresolved local grievances created a blueprint for how cultures accuse. The notion that hidden worship of strange forces in strange tongues could persist unnoticed became a recurring theme in American folklore. Lovecraft, writing 2 centuries later, was saturated in the afterimage of this. But this wasn't only a religious fear. By the late 19th century, European thinkers were reinterpreting these ideas through anthropology. James Fraser's The Golden Bough, 1890, treated myth as cultural fossil. Every strange ritual, every folk custom was seen as a survival, a remnant of pre-Christian, pre-rational belief that had somehow avoided extinction. Fraser described secret rites, sacred kings, and fertility cults not as stories, but as patterns. Importantly, he did not view them as fabrications. They were once real, and perhaps, in rural places or behind closed doors, still were. Lovecraft read Fraser. He also read contemporary folklorists who collected tales of witches, fairies, and local superstitions with the clinical tone of a biologist cataloging parasites. These scholars believed they were documenting the fading edge of belief. Lovecraft inverted the frame. What if they were witnessing its return? We must also consider Theosophy. Founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century, this occult movement claimed access to secret teachings preserved by ancient masters in Tibet and India. It fused Eastern philosophies with Western esotericism, creating a system where cosmic hierarchies, lost continents, and psychic evolution were taken as literal truths. Theosophy presented itself as a religion of hidden origins, elite initiates, and cyclical cataclysms. Lovecraft rejected its content, but clearly absorbed its structure. The idea of ancient knowledge passed through obscure texts, surviving in isolated communities, and pointing to truths too large for modern minds. This is the architecture of his mythos. Meanwhile, the field of psychology was beginning to offer its own disturbing insights. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and their contemporaries introduced the idea that individuals are shaped by unconscious forces, primal, irrational, and largely inaccessible. Jung, in particular, explored the concept of the collective unconscious, filled with archetypes older than civilization. While Lovecraft rarely engaged with these thinkers directly, their ideas echoed the same suspicion: that under the surface of rational thought, something vast and uncontrolled moves. This shift in understanding human nature, from rational to irrational, from conscious to unconscious, reshaped how belief was interpreted. A cult, in this light, was no longer just a community of worshippers. It became a symptom, a manifestation of the human psyche's failure to conform to Enlightenment ideals. Lovecraft's fiction reflects this precisely. His cults are not noble pagans or Gothic Satanists. They are fragments of something much older, glimpsed but never fully described. Their beliefs are not explained, only hinted at through chants, gestures, and architectural motifs. This vagueness is deliberate. It mirrors the anthropological method, where outsiders record without full understanding, and the psychological model, where symbols replace explanations. We must pause here and note a troubling comparison: the colonial gaze. Many 19th century anthropologists viewed non-Western religions as inferior, irrational, or corrupt, useful only as data. Lovecraft inherited this perspective. and his work reflects the racial and cultural biases of his time. However, he also turned the gaze inward. His most disturbing cults are not in distant lands, but in backwoods towns, coastal villages, and decaying New England lineages. The horror is not out there. It is within the civilized world, hidden in its blind spots. This self-inversion matters, suggests that the fear was never just of the other, but of what the other reveals about us. If ancient beliefs could survive unnoticed for generations, if rituals could persist beneath the surface of modernity, then the Enlightenment project had failed. Science, reason, and progress had not eliminated myth. They had only buried it deeper. At the heart of Lovecraft's philosophical horror lies this idea that belief, once formed, is almost impossible to kill. Cults do not survive because they are correct. They survive because they are functional. They provide meaning, identity, and continuity. They adapt. They shift language, symbols, and names, but the core remains. This is why Lovecraft's cults resemble both ancient fertility rites and modern secret societies. They are hybrids, residues of belief systems that outlast the civilizations that try to suppress them. And so, we arrive at a chilling conclusion. The philosophical antecedents of Lovecraft's cults are not supernatural. They are cultural, psychological, and historical. His stories are not about inventing horror. They are about revealing that the world already contains it, that beneath every society lies the possibility of belief systems that refuse to die. That belief, once formed, becomes structure, and that structure can wait. Language, in Lovecraft's fiction, does not clarify. It obstructs. It shrouds meaning, disrupts comprehension, and marks the threshold between human understanding and something older. His cults do not just worship unknowable forces. They speak in tongues that resist analysis. The words themselves become symptoms of intrusion. Consider the oft-cited chant from the Call of Cthulhu. Funglui Maglunaf. Cthulhu Relia Wugahnagul Ftagn. It is not a code to be broken. It is an assertion of separation. The language defies phonetic logic, intentionally constructed to evade smooth articulation. The result is a ritual phrase that can be recited but not internalized, sounded out but never truly understood. This is deliberate. In Lovecraft's cults, the inability to translate is not a failure. It is the point. We must examine how Lovecraft created this effect. He often employed non-Indo-European phonemes, consonant clusters, glottal stops, and unusual vowel pairings that evoke no linguistic ancestry. This is crucial. Languages that derive from known roots carry familiar rhythms and associations. Lovecraft's invented tongues instead feel dislocated, as if spoken by a species for whom human vocal cords are a limitation. The cultist is not merely saying forbidden words. He is straining against anatomy to do so. Etymology, typically used to trace words back to source, collapses here. Lovecraft offers no internal grammar, no lexicon, no root language. This absence achieves a specific effect. The language feels pre-human without needing to describe what came before. Rather than showing age through history, it signals age through non-belonging. The words do not fit. They are not meant to. This presents a sharp contrast to traditional occult texts. In grimoires, rituals often contain Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, languages chosen for their sacred associations. Even fictional texts like the Necronomicon mimic this convention, grounding their spells in a recognizable system of sacred speech. Lovecraft disrupts that tradition. His cults do not rely on holy languages. They use corrupted guttural phonemes that sound like language without behaving as one. The result is a ritual soundscape, more sonic than semantic. We must pause here. This inversion, language that reveals nothing, is a direct challenge to Enlightenment assumptions. Western tradition places enormous trust in language as a path to knowledge. To name something is to define it, to master it. Lovecraft's cults reverse this. To name the god is to lose comprehension. Knowledge becomes less stable after contact with these sounds, not more. This connects directly to symbolic writing. Lovecraft's stories often reference strange carvings, alien glyphs, and sigils whose patterns resist logic. These symbols, like the languages, are not decorative. They are functional expressions of belief. The cultist does not use these symbols to communicate with others. He uses them to reinforce alignment with something else. Here, language shifts from interpersonal to metaphysical. It is no longer for sharing. It is for anchoring, for establishing a tether between the human mind and something wholly outside it. Consider the shape-based writing in the Dunwich Horror, or the curiously crabbed hieroglyphs on the bas-relief in the Call of Cthulhu. These are not simply narrative color. They mark the intrusion of non-human ordering systems, symbols that structure reality differently. The implication is subtle but disturbing. To truly read these signs would require changing the reader. That brings us to the cult as a linguistic community. Cults, historically, maintain cohesion through insider language, terms, phrases, and chants known only to initiates. Lovecraft amplifies this dynamic. In his Mythos, speech itself becomes a gatekeeping mechanism. The ability to pronounce certain phrases is both proof of belonging and an act of transformation. One does not merely speak the name of an old one. One reorients the mind by doing so. There is an echo here of real-world esoteric traditions. In Kabbalah, for instance, the divine name is not simply a label. It is a structure of creative power. In ancient Egyptian ritual, pronunciation determined whether a god would respond. Even in Christianity, the act of invoking the sacred name carries metaphysical weight. Lovecraft knew these traditions. He stripped away their theological optimism and left behind only the weight, the unbearable consequence of utterance without understanding. What results is a semiotics of disintegration. Language does not build meaning. It erodes it. Symbols do, not clarify. They deform perception. In this way, cultic speech becomes an epistemic threat. It is not dangerous because of what it conveys. It is dangerous because it alters the conditions of knowing. This extends to names themselves. Lovecraft's entities, Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, carry names that function more like disturbances than references. They do not describe attributes. They do not explain domains. They resonate. The name is not a pointer toward the entity. It is an emanation of it. Why does this matter? Because it reinforces the most disturbing possibility in Lovecraft's work. That human cognition is not just limited, but unsuited to certain truths. His cults speak and write in ways that do not seek comprehension. They enact devotion without explanation. Their languages are structured to bypass meaning, moving instead toward alignment. This is not communication, it is transformation. To encounter their symbols is not to learn, but to be changed. Lovecraft's cults feel real not because they are described in detail, but because they are embedded within systems that signal authenticity. He did not construct myths as fantasy authors do, with world maps, named pantheons, and codified lore. Instead, he built evidence chains, layered fragments, conflicting sources, and academic narrators who doubt their own findings. The result is not belief, but plausibility. This distinction is key. Myth, in traditional literature, is often explained. Gods have genealogies. Rituals have origins. Texts describe cause and consequence. Lovecraft avoided this. He suggested depth without ever confirming it. His cults are not explicated. They are documented. The difference produces a shift in tone, from storytelling to reportage. Take the Call of Cthulhu. The story reads like an archive. Professor Angel's notes, Inspector Legrasse's police reports, the sculptor's nightmares. None are authoritative alone, but together they simulate the process of scholarly inquiry. The narrative proceeds not through revelation, but through accumulation. We are never given a full view. We are given enough to suspect one exists. This is myth building by implication. Lovecraft relied heavily on documentary forms. Newspaper clippings, personal diaries, ship logs, field notebooks. These are not just narrative devices. They are legitimization strategies. By borrowing the structure of academic or institutional records, he positioned his cults as objects of investigation, not imagination. They do not feel invented because they are never fully shown. They feel discovered, half exposed, like ruins whose purpose must be inferred. This method parallels the techniques of 19th century antiquarians who reconstructed ancient religions from fragments, broken statues, temple foundations, oral myths. Lovecraft mimicked their tone, careful, distant, slightly uncertain. His narrators speculate, they hesitate, they dismiss, then return. This hesitation is part of the authenticity. Certainty would break the illusion. Doubt preserves it. We must pause here and consider the Necronomicon. This fictional grimoire functions as a linchpin in Lovecraft's mythos, referenced across stories, but never fully revealed. It is said to be written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, translated by multiple scholars and stored in prestigious libraries. Harvard, Miskatonic, the British Museum. These details mimic real bibliographic records. Lovecraft gives it translators, print dates, and Latin titles, al-Azif. The more procedural the references, the more believable the object becomes. This is not just a literary trick. It reflects how forbidden texts function in real occult history. Grimoires like the Book of Abramelin, the Picatrix, or the Key of Solomon were often cited long before they were widely published. Their power derived from their inaccessibility. To possess the book was itself a kind of initiation. Lovecraft understood this. He turned the Necronomicon into a shared object across narratives, never shown, always cited. His cults operate in the same way. They are not monolithic. There is no central doctrine. Instead, there are local versions, Louisiana bayous, New England fishing towns, Pacific Islanders, Greenlandic tribes. Each variation appears independent, yet they all evoke the same core truth. This geographic dispersal serves two purposes. First, it simulates anthropological fieldwork, scattered data points suggesting a larger, hidden system. Second, it implies scale. These are not isolated cults. They are nodes in something older than culture. Lovecraft never defines what that something is, and this is essential. He avoids the genre trap of explaining too much. His mythos is not a theology, it is a pattern. The cults provide the shape, but never the resolution. Their endurance is not due to persuasive belief, but to the failure of belief systems that tried to replace them. They are not old because they have lasted. They are old because they were always here. This technique, implying deep time without defining it, parallels geological thinking. In the 19th century, scientists began describing Earth's history in epochs. vast, layered, unhuman. Lovecraft adapted this idea to belief. His cults are not new religions. They are fault lines, evidence of spiritual structures laid down long before human memory. Their rituals are echoes. Their symbols are strata. The cultist is not a believer. He is a remnant. And yet, Lovecraft frames these remnants with modern tools. The investigator, often skeptical and rational, uncovers traces, a carving, a chant, a genealogy. These fragments never cohere, but they align just enough to suggest something coherent lies beneath. This is the documentary illusion, the sense that more information exists just beyond reach. It compels readers not through fear, but through archival hunger, the desire to piece together what has been deliberately scattered. We must ask, why does this strategy work so well? Because it mimics how real history operates. Most of what we know about ancient mystery cults, Eleusinian rites, Mithraic initiation, Dionysian processions, comes from fragmentary evidence. We have ruins, partial texts, and contradictory accounts. The result is not certainty, but haunting ambiguity. Lovecraft's genius was to replicate that ambiguity in fiction. He didn't invent myth. He reverse-engineered the experience of encountering it. This is why his cults continue to feel plausible. They are not described as active conspiracies, but as persistent structures. Not groups, but frameworks. They do not announce themselves. They are discovered reluctantly by those who go looking for something else. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. Lovecraft's narrative authenticity lies not in how much he tells us, but in how much he withholds. His cults feel real because they resemble what we already know. That belief, once buried, does not die. It fossilizes, it erodes slowly, and under the right conditions, it resurfaces. Cosmic horror begins with one devastating idea. The universe does not care that we exist. Lovecraft's cults arise from this premise, not in defiance of it, but in alignment with it. They are not responses to suffering or attempts to make sense of evil. They are acknowledgments that meaning itself may be irrelevant. This is not nihilism in the modern sense. It is worse. It is the possibility that there was never a place for us in the first place. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator famously concludes, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." This line is not just poetic, it is philosophical. It suggests that coherence is a threat. To fully understand reality would not lead to enlightenment. It would lead to collapse. Cults in Lovecraft's universe are composed of those who do correlate too much and are changed for it. Their rituals, rather than clarifying the cosmos, ritualize its incomprehensibility. This leads to the second concept, entropy. In Lovecraft's Mythos, the universe does not evolve toward order, it unravels. The gods are not creators, but forces of dissolution. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, is not a judge, not a savior, not even a destroyer. He simply is, a pulsing center of chaos around which all existence swirls mindlessly. To worship such a force is not irrational, it is brutally consistent. Cultists do not seek salvation, they seek to synchronize with decay. Their rites mirror natural erosion, repetition without climax, structure without purpose. We must pause here. In most traditional religions, rituals create continuity between human and divine, between past and future. In Lovecraft's cults, ritual ensures dissolution. It is the act of aligning oneself with a reality that deconstructs the human frame. The chant becomes entropy in linguistic form, structured nonsense, decaying syntax, meaning disassembled over time. What survives is not the doctrine, but the effect. Then there is the dream, not metaphorical, but literal. Lovecraft's cosmos frequently places revelation inside dreams, visions of submerged cities, non-Euclidean temples, or entities that watch but do not speak. This is not escapism. It is a shift in epistemology. Dream reality becomes the truer world, while waking life is a fragile illusion. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist's consciousness is displaced across aeons. He returns with memories too large to contain. His dreams fracture time, self, and sanity. This is the most unsettling concept, that awareness itself is not fixed. If perception can be reoriented, if identity is a surface tension, then cultic belief is not a choice. It is an outcome. The mind does not merely discover horror. It is reformatted by it. The cultist is not persuaded. He is restructured. Lovecraft's fiction refuses comfort. His philosophical framework is one in which human meaning systems, science, faith, morality are provincial. The universe is not malevolent. It is indifferent. That indifference is what makes it terrifying. The cultist, however, does not deny this. He accepts it, or rather, he yields to it. Worship becomes an act of surrender, not to a God who cares, but to a cosmos that doesn't. To return to the earlier line, the inability to correlate all contents is merciful. Cults are composed of those who lose that mercy. Their prayers are not appeals. They are acknowledgments. Not to change fate, but to bow before its irrelevance. This is not faith. It is exposure. And what survives after the collapse of all systems is not meaning, but repetition. The chant, the symbol, the ritual posture. In a world where entropy rules and dreams fracture reality, the cultist becomes something new, not a believer, but a function, a mechanism through which inhuman truth briefly touches the human, plain, before vanishing again. In Lovecraft's Mythos, the entities worshipped by cults are not gods in any theological sense. They do not create, punish, or save. They do not speak moral law. They exist, vast, ancient, and unknowable. The cults that revere them do not do so out of reverence, but recognition. These entities are not symbols. They are conditions. To encounter them is to understand that existence is structured around forces we were never meant to perceive. Cthulhu, the most famous of these beings, is not defined by action, but by presence. He waits dreaming in Aurelia, not imprisoned, but latent. His reawakening is not framed as invasion, but return. In the Call of Cthulhu, cultists describe his reappearance with joy, not dread. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. This is not a prophecy, it is a statement of cycle. Cthulhu is entropy shaped into form, an ancient inevitability whose recurrence signals the failure of time to contain what came before us. Nyarlathotep stands apart in function, but not in essence. Unlike the other great old ones, he appears often, speaks, and even takes human form, but his coherence is deceptive. He is not a messenger in service of a truth. He is what truth looks like when stripped of human context. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he mocks humanity's need for understanding, offering dreams as traps rather than visions. The cults that follow him do not seek knowledge. They dissolve in his presence. Then there is Azathoth, the central blind chaos around which everything spins. Azathoth is not worshipped, he is endured. The idea that the cosmos has a center, and that this center is mindless, is perhaps Lovecraft's most devastating metaphysical claim. Around Azathoth, a court of mindless flute players performs eternally, not in praise, in sustenance. The music is what holds reality together. The cultist in this case does not pray. He participates in a system of maintenance without meaning. This distinction matters. These entities do not command loyalty. They evoke recognition. They are not separate from reality. They are its scaffolding. Lovecraft's entities are not enemies to be defeated. They are conditions to be accepted. The cults do not serve them to gain favor. They serve them because there is nothing else. The Dreamland's beings, lesser entities, often glimpsed in visions, extend this logic. They appear in stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Silver Key, where dream logic replaces cause and effect. Here, the entities are fragmented, partial, spectral. They drift through layers of perception, half symbol, half force. They do not teach, they unmake. The Dreamlands are not escapist. They are reminders that consciousness itself is porous. Across these depictions, a consistent pattern emerges. The entities do not care. Their indifference is not cruelty. It is scale. To them, humans are not significant enough to notice. This is the rupture point. Traditional horror relies on being seen by the monster, the ghost, the judge. Lovecraft's horror emerges from being unseen in a universe that proceeds, unfolds, and collapses regardless of our presence. And yet, the cults persist. They chant, they carve, they transmit names. Why? Because contact, however one-sided, is still contact. The existence of these forces, even if indifferent, validates the cultist's perception. It proves that the world is structured, but not for us. The entities are not metaphors. They are not stand-ins for war, disease, or death. They are otherness itself. They occupy a category that resists symbolization. This is why descriptions of them always fail. Non-Euclidean, gelatinous, many-angled. These are not images. They are failures of translation. The entities do not exist in contradiction to reality. They exist in its blind spots. And so the cults that form around them do not organize doctrine. They preserve fragments, a name, a shape, a sound. This preservation is not devotion. It is compulsion. The entity does not ask for worship, but its proximity requires response. Lovecraft's entities are not monstrous. They are foundational. They exist beneath language, beneath perception, beneath narrative. And when they rise, however briefly, they do not destroy us. They reveal that we were never central to begin with. Lovecraft's cults do not recruit. They happen to people. Interaction with the entities of the mythos, whether through dreams, texts, rituals, or proximity, produces a cognitive shift. The result is not simply fear or trauma, but something more profound, a collapse of interpretive frameworks. Madness, in this context, is not a malfunction of the mind. It is what happens when human cognition encounters scale beyond its design. In story after story, madness follows contact. But this is not random deterioration, it is structured disintegration. In the shadow. Out of time, the protagonist Nathaniel Peaslee is mentally displaced across aeons by a race known as the Great Race of Yith. Upon return, he does not scream or convulse. He researches, he dreams, he remembers. The madness here is not noise. It is pattern recognition pushed past the point of usefulness. He is not broken. He is misaligned. This type of breakdown often begins with information. A chant heard at the wrong time, a passage read aloud, a shape glimpsed where no shape should be. Lovecraft repeatedly frames these moments as threshold experiences. The mind attempts to contextualize what it has seen, and fails. In Dagon, the narrator stumbles upon a monolith carved with inhuman figures. He is not attacked. He is left with the knowledge. His suicide note is not hysterical. It is precise. We must pause here. In traditional horror, madness is often used to indicate possession, moral weakness, or supernatural corruption. Lovecraft reverses this. Madness is not a symptom of evil. It is a symptom of accuracy. The cultist who appears deranged may simply be functioning correctly within an unshared ontology. This reframing forces a question. Is the cultist irrational or simply operating under a different set of premises? This has deep implications for how Lovecraft portrays cult behavior. It is rarely chaotic. It is rhythmic, recursive, structured. Rituals repeat, chants cycle, gestures loop. This repetition resembles obsessive behavior, but it also mimics pattern entrainment. The human brain attempting to stabilize against incoherent input. The cultist is not flailing, he is synchronizing. And yet, from the outside, this looks like madness. The police reports in The Call of Cthulhu describe orgiastic rites. But the descriptions are secondhand, filtered through suspicion. The cultists themselves are rarely allowed to speak at length. When they do, as in the case of the delirious Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen, their testimony is fragmented, haunted by sensation more than fact. Madness here is not theatrical. It is administrative. The world cannot process what they've seen, so it classifies them as broken. This is the core function of madness in Lovecraft's mythos, containment. It marks the boundary between what can be integrated into human meaning and what must be discarded. The cultist does not cross that boundary. He erases it. His worldview is not shattered. It is replaced. He no longer seeks to explain the universe. He simply performs its rhythms. This performance is not individual. Cults provide structure, however tenuous, to those who can no longer interpret reality through conventional lenses. In a sense, they are therapeutic. They offer community, language, and ritual for minds that have touched the unstructured. But this therapy comes at a cost. The cultist must abandon coherence. He must operate within a system where logic is flexible, time is recursive, and identity is optional. What results is neither sanity nor insanity. It is liminality. The cultist occupies a space between human and post-human understanding. His mind is no longer shaped by social consensus. It is shaped by alignment with forces that do not explain themselves. To the outsider, he is mad. To the mythos, he is adapted. Madness, then, is not a failure of reason. It is what reason looks like when it has been recalibrated to match a reality that no longer resembles ours. In Lovecraft's mythos, forbidden knowledge is not dangerous because it leads to corruption. It is dangerous because it undoes comprehension itself. His cults do not traffic in secrets that can be revealed. They preserve knowledge that destabilizes the conditions of knowing. This is not a barrier of access. It is a barrier of structure. Knowledge in traditional horror often follows a moral logic. Some truths are hidden because they are evil. Transgression brings punishment. Lovecraft discards this framework. The truths uncovered by his protagonists and preserved by his cults are not evil. They are indifferent. The danger lies not in what the truths reveal, but in how they deform everything around them: memory, perception, chronology, and identity. We must begin with the Dunwich horror. When Professor Armitage deciphers the rituals used to summon Yog-Sothoth, he does not gain power. He gains proximity to collapse. The deeper he reads, the more the distinctions between species, timelines, and realities blur. Knowledge here does not accumulate. It dissolves the boundaries that made knowledge useful. The cultists in the story are not evil sorcerers. They are archivists of a system in which human meaning is a local phenomenon, soon to be overwritten. This is epistemic collapse, not simply losing facts, but losing the ability to organize them. It is not ignorance, it is the exhaustion of interpretive models. When Lovecraft's narrators encounter forbidden texts, most often the Necronomicon, they do not misread them. They read them too well, and in doing so, they reach a point where reading becomes non-recoverable. To read is to become implicated. The Necronomicon itself functions not as a manual, but as an infection vector. It does not transmit knowledge like a textbook. It reconfigures perception. The reader begins in analysis and ends in transformation. As one narrator writes, "I read and I knew." That single verb shift marks the collapse. Knowing is no longer something controlled. It becomes something done to the knower. Consider this carefully. The cultist's mind is not filled with new information. It is emptied of scaffolding. The old categories, true, false, self-other, time, space, fail. In The Whisperer in Darkness, for instance, the protagonist attempts to communicate with the Mygo using human language and logic. What he receives instead is the offer to transport his brain surgically into a container, to travel and learn beyond the body. The implication is not just grotesque, it is conceptual. The body is no longer required for knowing. The cultist accepts. He reformats himself. This leads to the disturbing role of cults as epistemic custodians. They do not preserve sacred truths. They preserve ways of being that no longer require truth. Their rituals are not meant to teach. They are meant to replicate the mental conditions that allow unstructured reality to be endured. To join a cult in Lovecraft's world is not to believe something. It is to unlearn the framework that makes belief necessary. And this is where forbidden knowledge differs from mere secrecy. Secrecy implies content withheld. Forbidden knowledge, in the mythos, is content that cannot be reintegrated. Once known, it cannot be unknown. It remains lodged not as information, but as disruption. The horror, then, is not in the cult's teachings. It is in their effect. To glimpse what they know is to feel the foundation of reality give way, not with explosion, but with quiet certainty. The cultist chants not because he understands, but because understanding is no longer relevant. He chants because he remembers what came before understanding. Forbidden knowledge is the final form of horror in Lovecraft's world. Not death, not suffering, but the collapse of meaning itself. The cult survives because it does not resist this collapse. It requires it. The earliest glimpses of Lovecraft's cults do not begin with the call of Cthulhu, but with earlier, more skeletal stories where the shape of devotion appears without formal doctrine. In Dagon, 1917, we encounter a traumatized narrator recounting his encounter with a monstrous sea god. The creature is worshipped by immense carved idols, and the implication is clear. Someone, something, once performed ritual here. The story lacks an active cult, but the architecture is present. This is mythos in embryonic form. The idea that worship predates history, and that its traces remain embedded in the landscape. By the time Lovecraft writes The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, he has formalized this impulse into a multi-layered narrative. The cult in this story is global, decentralized, and functionally immortal. It exists in New Orleans swamps, Pacific Islands, and under surveillance by skeptical academics. Each sighting is partial, each testimony fragmented. Yet together, they assemble a coherent image. a belief system that persists without central authority. The chant, Funglui Milwinaf Cthulhu Relier Wagahnagel Ftagen, recurs across continents, suggesting not communication, but convergence. The narrative function of these cults is not exposition, it is friction. The story unfolds through documents, police reports, personal accounts, anthropological field notes, all of which point to something just outside their interpretive range. When Inspector Legrasse raids the Louisiana ritual site, he finds not answers, but echoes. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men. The cult becomes a vector for cosmic memory, preserving knowledge that contradicts everything empirical systems are designed to protect. This pattern, fragmented sources pointing toward a suppressed continuity, repeats in The Festival, 1923. Here the narrator visits a decayed New England town for what he believes is a familial holiday. Instead, he is led through underground catacombs where robed figures chant in an ancient tongue. The story is sparse on explanation, but dense in atmosphere. The cult's function is not to inform, but to initiate. Not the narrator, but the reader. The rituals are dreamlike. The identities of the celebrants never clarified. What matters is the mood, the recognition that history has layers that cannot be reconciled. Intertextuality deepens this effect. Lovecraft did not create a closed mythos. He built a referential network. Names and places recur. Miskatonic University, Arkham, the Necronomicon, not as world-building, but as suggestion. When a text references a ritual in Innsmouth or a translation of the Al-Azif, it does not explain. It connects. Cults function as the glue between stories. They allow the reader to sense a shared infrastructure beneath the narratives without ever mapping it fully. This is most clearly demonstrated in the 1929 story The Dunwich Horror, where the Whateleys conduct dark rites to summon Yog-Sothoth. The story provides more detail than earlier works, actual incantations, genealogies, and ritual procedures. But even here, the cult's beliefs remain opaque. The townspeople describe the Whateleys as queer, their rites as blasphemies, but never penetrate their logic. The cult does not exist to be decoded. It exists to prove that not all systems can be understood from the outside. The evolution from Dagon to Dunwich reveals Lovecraft's increasing comfort with indirect storytelling. His cults become more present, but no less mysterious. They are never protagonists. They do not monologue. They remain fixed in ritual space, performing beliefs that make sense only within their own ruined cosmologies. Their consistency across stories is not in character or dogma, but in effect. They distort. They disorient. They suggest the presence of a universe where worship is not aimed upward, but outward or downward. Lovecraft's genius lies in this refusal to consolidate. His cults never harden into institutions. They remain glimpsed, partial, implied. Their power is cumulative. Story by story, we learn not who they are, but what kind of world requires them. If one story defines the mythic structure of Lovecraft's cults, it is The Call of Cthulhu, 1926. This story functions not just as a narrative, but as a thesis. Cults are evidence of something older than culture, and their survival is not aberration, but proof of design. The tale unfolds through fragments, journals, police reports, personal testimonies, and we are never given a unified account. What emerges instead is a cross-cultural pattern of recurrence. The horror does not lie in what the cult believes, but in how many people believe it separately. At the center of the story is Inspector Legrasse's 1908 raid on a swamp ritual in Louisiana. The details are specific: torches, rhythmic chanting, carved idols of inhuman design. The worshippers are described as degenerate, a term that reflects both Lovecraft's prejudices and his aesthetic of decay. But what Legrasse uncovers is not criminal, it is continuity. The idol-seized matches one found thousands of miles away by a Norwegian sailor. The chant, Funglui Maglubunaf Cthulhu Relie Wugahnagel Ftagen, resurfaces again and again. This is not communication, it is convergence. The story's narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, assembles these pieces after inheriting his uncle's research. His tone is not emotional, it is academic, careful, burdened. He writes, "My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were." This line is crucial. It marks the shift not from disbelief to belief, but from coherence to collapse. The cult's power is not in persuasion, it is in destabilization. The closer Thurston reads, the less he understands. Knowledge does not clarify, it corrodes. Cthulhu himself is never seen directly by the cult. He remains submerged in Relia, a sunken city described in wrong geometry. The cult chants not to summon him, but to align themselves with his return. This distinction matters. They do not claim power. They do not demand conversion. Their rituals exist to wait correctly. In this sense, the cult is not religious. It is geological, layered into time, synchronized with cosmic rhythm, indifferent to human affairs. The moment of Cthulhu's partial emergence, when the crew of the Emma accidentally opens his tomb, is described in terms that resist form. He is a mountain walked or stumbled, a being of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head. The cult's belief is validated, but not resolved. Cthulhu does not speak. He does not act with intention. He simply is. The cult never needed a miracle. They needed only confirmation that time moves in circles. What the Call of Cthulhu reveals, more than any other story, is that the cult is not an antagonist. It is an interpretive tool. The worshippers do not cause horror. They recognize it. The true horror lies with the reader and with Thurston, who cannot return to unknowing. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, he writes. But someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality. This is a warning against synthesis. The cultists live in those vistas. The rest of us glimpse them and call it madness. The brilliance of the story lies in its structure. It never lingers on ritual, never explains doctrine. The cult is seen only through the reactions of outsiders. Yet its presence dominates. Each detail, the carved idol, the chant, the synchronized dreams, adds weight to the idea that these are not believers in a false religion. They are participants in a true one, not true in the sense of righteousness, but true in the sense of reality aligned. In the end, the cult survives. The raid does not end them. Cthulhu returns to slumber, but the reader, like Thurston, is left altered. Not because evil triumphed, but because certainty failed. The cult does not ask for understanding. It demonstrates that understanding was never ours to begin with. If the Call of Cthulhu introduces cults as global, ancient, and abstract, The Shadow over Innsmouth, written 1931, published 1936, localizes the phenomenon and gives it blood. Here the cult is not a rumor or footnote. It is a living, intergenerational system embedded in a decaying New England town. Where earlier stories suggest ritual as forgotten, residue, Innsmouth reveals cultic belief as a family structure, a civic order, and a biological condition. The unnamed narrator visits Innsmouth out of curiosity, following whispers of strange architecture and hostile locals. What he finds is far more coherent, a town unified by shared silence, strange customs, and physical features described as queer, narrow-headed, and fishy. These traits are not metaphors, they are manifestations. The cult in Innsmouth is not symbolic of degeneration. It is degeneration as theology. The townspeople worship the deep ones, amphibious entities from beneath the sea, through a pact made generations earlier. In exchange for gold and fish, they offer rituals, breeding, and eventual transformation. Obed Marsh, the sea captain who initiated the pact, functions as the cult's founder, not through doctrine, but through commerce. This is critical. The cult does not emerge from spiritual crisis or philosophical hunger. It begins as a transaction, an alignment of interests between humans and non-humans. The ceremonies performed in the Esoteric Order of Dagon are not acts of devotion. They are maintenance. The town survives by sacrificing its autonomy. It thrives by giving up its shape. The horror escalates gradually. The narrator uncovers genealogical secrets, hears whispered chants behind locked doors, and eventually witnesses a procession of deep ones emerging from the sea. What makes this story singular in the mythos is its twist. The narrator is descended from the cult. His initial revulsion gives way to revelation. By the story's end, he embraces his legacy, writing, "I shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea, and dive down through black abysses. I shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever." This is not defeat. It is acceptance, not of evil, but of truth. The cult in Innsmouth functions differently from that in Cthulhu. It is not distributed or hidden. It is concentrated. It controls the town's institutions, architecture, and bloodlines. It is less a religion than a replacement culture, one that has evolved to be physically and socially inseparable from its gods. The Order of Dagon is not a church. It is a genealogical archive, tracking who will change, when, and how deeply. This shift introduces a disturbing biological dimension. In the Call of Cthulhu, worship is a matter of alignment. In Innsmouth, it is a matter of inheritance. The cult is not joined. It is inherited through the body. This evolution reflects a deepening of Lovecraft's horror. Not merely that belief persists, but that it alters species boundaries. The cultist is not just a believer. He is a liminal creature, halfway between human and something else. Narratively, this inversion is potent. The reader begins aligned with the narrator, as a rational outsider investigating a degenerate town. But as the narrator's identity erodes, so does the reader's alignment. What seemed like horror becomes revelation. The final turn is not tragedy. It is reclamation. The cult, rather than being destroyed or escaped, is accepted as destiny. Intertextually, the shadow over Innsmouth connects back to Dagon and forward to later expansions of the Deep One mythos. The sea, once a symbol of unknown danger, becomes a homeland. The cult is not a fringe sect. It is the remnant of a broader truth about humanity's origins, or perhaps its destination. More than any other story, Innsmouth shows what happens when the cult wins. Not through violence, through inheritance, through slow, irreversible transformation. And the most unsettling realization, the transformation feels right. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos did not end. It metastasized. His correspondents, protege, and admirers expanded the universe he had only partially mapped. Chief among them was August Derleth, who did more than preserve Lovecraft's legacy. He restructured it. Through editorial control and extensive fiction of his own, Derleth introduced a moral framework foreign to Lovecraft's vision. The cults in this altered mythos began to serve gods of good and evil, forces locked in cosmic battle. The effect was not clarification, it was flattening. Derleth's major intervention was the elder gods versus great old ones dichotomy. He positioned the former as benevolent protectors, the latter as chaotic antagonists. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, which he co-authored using fragments from Lovecraft's notes, cults are depicted not as inevitable byproducts of cosmic truth, but as villains in a moral drama. Their worship becomes corruption rather than alignment. The result is a familiar narrative structure: heresy, punishment, restoration. This is not cosmic horror. It is cosmic theology. This shift is not minor. In Lovecraft's universe, cults function because the universe lacks moral order. In Derleth's, they function because they oppose that order. The horror transforms from ontological to ethical. The cultist is no longer terrifying because he has seen too much, but because he has chosen wrong. This change fundamentally alters how the reader experiences the mythos. It offers the possibility of resistance, and, implicitly, salvation. Many later writers followed Derleth's structure, even as they added new layers. Brian Lumley, for instance, introduced more organized cult networks in his Titus Crow series, blending spy thriller tropes with mythos entities. The cult becomes a conspiracy, an adversarial force with goals, leadership, and agendas. This development makes the cult narratively useful, but philosophically inert. It becomes a threat, not a symptom. Other authors moved in different directions. Ramsey Campbell's British mythos stories relocate the horror to post-industrial towns and focus on ritual decay. His cults are not triumphant or well-organized. They are falling apart, sustained by fading memory and misinterpreted rites. In stories like The Inhabitant of the Lake, the cult's power lies not in its strength, but in its resilience, a return to Lovecraft's model of belief as residue. Campbell's approach restores ambiguity, but remains shaped by the genre's evolving expectations. The rise of role-playing games, particularly Call of Cthulhu, 1981, also altered the cult's function. In game mechanics, cults became antagonists, enemies to be investigated, infiltrated, and dismantled. Their rituals had clear effects. Their hierarchies had names. This was necessary for gameplay, but it reinforced a structural clarity that Lovecraft had deliberately avoided. Players needed to know the rules. But horror, in the original mythos, came from the sense that there were no rules to learn, only patterns that swallowed you when glimpsed. Some contemporary writers have sought to reclaim the original ambiguity. Caitlin R. Kiernan's mythos stories, for example, emphasize epistemic instability and blurred identity. Her cults are not groups with goals. They are environments, moods, persistent orientations towards something incomprehensible. In stories like Houses Under the Sea, the cult is indistinguishable from the transformation it causes. This is a return to Lovecraft's core technique, suggesting more than explaining and refusing resolution. We must acknowledge, too, that the mythos has become a shared world. With that shift comes negotiation. Writers import modern themes, colonialism, gender, climate collapse, and mold cults accordingly. This can be illuminating, but also diluting. The more a cult functions like an institution, the less it functions like Lovecraft intended, as a rupture in human assumptions. The evolution is revealing. Where Lovecraft's cults were symptoms of contact with cosmic reality, later portrayals make them problems to solve. Their mystery becomes threat. Their rituals become weapons. The unknowable becomes knowable enough to fight. In doing so, much of the original terror, rooted in the failure of interpretation, fades. And yet, something survives. The names remain. The fragments recur. The cults continue to chant in half-translated tongues, in basements and beneath waves, not because they are enemies, but because they are reminders. Reminders that the universe is not aligned with us, and never was. The Mythos cults were never meant to feel real, yet that is precisely what has happened. From the late 20th century onward, fictional rituals and invented chants have bled into modern folklore, forums, conspiracy boards, and amateur investigations. What began as literary suggestion now circulates as urban legend. Some treat Lovecraft's cults as metaphor. Others treat them as misunderstood history. A few treat them as fact. One of the earliest hoaxes tied to this shift was the so-called Church of Starry Wisdom pamphlet, which appeared in the 1970s in occult bookstores and zines. Claiming to be a revival of the cult described in The Haunter of the Dark, the pamphlet detailed rites, sigils, and altered consciousness techniques. Though clearly fictional, it was copied, cited, and eventually believed. Its power came not from credibility, but from structure. It looked like the residue of something long suppressed. That illusion of continuity was enough. This pattern repeats in digital spaces. On forums like Reddit's r/occult or 4chan's /ochx, discussions of deep-sea rituals, eldritch frequencies, and sleep-speaking groups borrow Lovecraftian language without attribution. The line between literary reference and actual belief collapses. Users debate whether Ardlier is metaphor or location. They describe dreams shared across continents. Whether sincere or ironic, the behavior mimics cult activity, secrecy, repetition, and the transmission of knowledge that cannot be verified but must be protected. In YouTube and TikTok spaces, videos emerge claiming to document real cult sites. Abandoned churches, caves with strange symbols, coastal ruins supposedly tied to the Order of Dagon. These are often staged or misinterpreted, but the aesthetic persists. Grainy footage, distorted audio, and untranslated glyphs mimic the presentation of forbidden knowledge. The form, not the content, creates the effect. It feels real because it behaves like something real that has been hidden. We must ask, why does this keep happening? Because the idea of ancient cults beneath the surface of modern life fulfills several psychological needs. It offers mystery without conclusion, structure without authority, and participation without institutional control. Belief is not required, only engagement. These hoaxes and sightings persist because they allow people to rehearse the sensation of forbidden knowledge without the danger of actual heresy. They simulate transgression. There is also a deeper, universal impulse, the belief that something has been forgotten on purpose, that beneath our rational systems lie older truths, less comforting, more honest. Lovecraft's cults suggest that history has blind spots, and that those blind spots were put there to protect us. When modern people fabricate real mythos cults, they are not just playing. They are testing the boundary between fiction and suppressed memory. It's worth noting how rarely these sightings result in actual belief systems. The cults do not become religions. They become rituals of attention. Whispered references, journal entries, coordinates buried in ARGs, The power is not in faith, it's in suggestion. And that is the final trick Lovecraft left behind. He created fictions structured like rumors. Once told, they behave like contagion. They spread, mutate, and return in forms even their originator could not have controlled. And the implications? They remain unspoken, which is why they linger. Lovecraft's cults have proven remarkably adaptable, not as full systems of belief, but as aesthetic frameworks. In film, games, and music, they recur not because people believe in them, but because they behave like belief. The structure of forbidden ritual, unknowable worship, and slow psychological erosion is easily transposed into visual and interactive media. What results is not a literal continuation of the mythos, but a cultural echo that replicates its function. Mystery without resolution, devotion without clarity. In cinema, Lovecraftian cults appear across genres. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, features a novelist whose work incites mass madness. Fans become followers, readers become worshippers of a new, reality-destabilizing truth. The cult's rituals are not explicitly shown. They emerge in behavior, erratic speech, violent recurrence, and an inability to distinguish fiction from fact. The film isn't an adaptation of Lovecraft, but a meta-commentary on how mythos logic spreads. More direct homages exist. The Void, 2016, features a remote hospital, besieged by robed cultists and cosmic monstrosities. The cult in question follows a doctor who promises transformation beyond death, through rituals that open gateways to other dimensions. The film replicates mythos structure. Little explanation, symbols without clear reference, and a plot that dissolves into perception. The cult's function is not to explain the horror. It is to create a ritual space for it. In video games, the Lovecraftian cult has become a staple. Bloodborne, 2015, developed by From Software, explores a city corrupted by eldritch knowledge disguised as medical science. Cultic behavior emerges not through organized religion, but through repeated rituals, transfusions, and dream exposure. By the time the player encounters the School of Mensis, worship is indistinguishable from madness. The rituals work, but what they summon is not for humans to see. Another example, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, translates The Shadow over Innsmouth into a first-person descent into ritual paranoia. The townspeople's silence, their collective denial, and the structure of the esoteric order of Dagon all become obstacles to interpretation. The player does not fight a cult. The player survives proximity to one. The mechanics themselves induce fragility. Madness meters, distorted vision, and unreliable narration simulate epistemic instability. In music, particularly in doom, black metal, and ambient subgenres, mythos cult aesthetics appear as sonic rituals. Bands like Portal, Sun O, and Dead Can Dance incorporate droning repetition, guttural vocals, and ritualistic rhythm. The lyrics often reference names like Yog-Sothoth or R'lyeh, but the meaning is secondary to tone. The listener is not meant to understand. They are meant to be immersed. The music mimics the logic of the chant, cyclical, wordless, decaying. Why does this structure translate so well across media? Because Lovecraftian cults do not require lore. They require atmosphere. They function as environmental threats, never fully explained, but always shaping perception. Their rituals don't demand belief. They demand presence. For creators, this provides a flexible toolkit: masks, symbols, chants, language fragments. For audiences, it offers a space to experience horror as participation rather than observation. This also explains why the cult often becomes the setting rather than the antagonist. In Midsummer 2019, while not overtly mythos-based, the structure is familiar. Isolation, cyclical ritual, symbolic language, and slow indoctrination into a worldview that erases the self. The cult is not defeated, it is entered. The horror is not their violence, it's their coherence. Across these adaptations, the cult is rarely about power, it is about transformation. The worshippers are not seeking control, they are seeking escape from death, from linear time, from the self. The ritual becomes the only stable point in a collapsing reality, and the audience, by engaging with the medium, becomes complicit in that performance. This is why mythos cults persist, not because they are understood, but because they offer a form of unknowing, a symbolic system that explains nothing and changes everything. And in a culture increasingly saturated with information, systems that resist explanation have their own kind of power. In the decades since Lovecraft's death, his cults have not remained confined to fiction. They've been adopted, consciously and unconsciously, by subcultures, academic theorists, spiritual communities, and internet collectives, not as literal belief systems, but as conceptual tools, ways of exploring power, secrecy, and alienation. What began as horror literature has become, in fragments, a framework for understanding the world's more elusive systems, those that organize human life but refuse explanation. Among esoteric and occult circles, references to mythos cults often appear without satire. Groups like the Esoteric Order of Dagon, a fictional invention from the shadow over Innsmouth, have been repurposed in real-world rituals, especially within chaos magic communities. Here, the logic is not belief in deep ones, it is symbolic engagement. Practitioners invoke Lovecraftian names as stand-ins for existential forces: entropy, madness, the void. The cult becomes a metaphor for initiation, not into secret knowledge, but into epistemic surrender. This reflects a broader trend in modern occultism: the embrace of invented traditions. Just as Thelema and Discordianism drew from literary and satirical sources, Lovecraftian cult structures are appropriated as useful fictions. The power lies not in truth, but in ritual form. Masks, chants, and sigils function regardless of origin. The cult aesthetic, obscure symbols, hidden history, destabilizing truths, becomes a language through which new identities are shaped. Academia, too, has taken interest. Scholars in literature, philosophy, and cultural studies have used mythos cults to explore the boundaries of knowledge, belief, and narrative. Lovecraft's work has been interpreted through the lenses of post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, and even speculative realism. The cult, in this context, becomes a theoretical site where language fails, where subjectivity dissolves, where systems reveal their internal incoherence. Consider Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, which treats Lovecraft not as storyteller, but as philosopher of the unthinkable. For Thacker, the cult functions as an interface between the human world and what he calls the world without us, a reality that exists independently of perception, knowledge, or meaning. Cultic ritual, in this frame, is not symbolic. It is ontological leakage, evidence that the boundaries of our systems are already compromised. This appropriation is not limited to theory. Internet subcultures frequently adopt mythos elements as ambient worldview. Conspiracy communities, particularly on fringe forums, sometimes echo Lovecraftian logic. The belief in ancient hidden systems controlling history, the use of unverified texts, the obsession with decoding truths that may themselves be designed to destroy the decoder. The cult here is not an object of belief. It is a narrative shape, a way to process powerlessness. But the most interesting appropriations are often the most subtle. Art collectives, sound artists, and immersive theater groups have used mythos cult structures to explore themes of surveillance, ecological collapse, and technological overreach. In these works, the cult is not a relic. It is a mirror. It reflects how institutions speak without revealing, how rituals are performed without understanding, how belief is enacted without certainty. Why does this continue? Because the Lovecraftian cult offers something few systems do: ambiguity without failure. It does not need to be right. It only needs to linger. It thrives on half-knowing, on suggestive repetition, on structures that feel like revelation, but deliver only transformation. In a culture saturated with facts, the mythos cult remains one of the few symbolic forms that resists resolution. Its appropriations, esoteric, academic, or aesthetic, persist because they model a kind of knowing that does not require explanation. And sometimes that's all we really want, not understanding, but the sensation that something deeper is happening, just beneath the surface. Lovecraft's cults endure not because people believe in them, but because they articulate a truth we are still unwilling to face: that human meaning systems may be arbitrary, fragile, and easily dismantled. The horror his cults represent is not supernatural, it is conceptual. They persist in the cultural imagination because they offer a model of thought unbound by human logic. That model is disturbing, but it also answers a quiet fear many of us carry: that reality does not care whether we understand it. At their core, Lovecraftian cults suggest that belief does not require clarity, morality, or even sanity. It only requires structure. This is perhaps their most unsettling philosophical contribution. We are used to thinking of belief as something tied to truth or hope. His cults expose another function: belief as adaptation. Faced with a universe that offers no narrative, no direction, and no place for us, belief becomes a form of cognitive survival. The cultists chance not to change the world, but to withstand it. Psychologically, this confronts us with a paradox. On one hand, humans crave certainty. On the other, we are drawn to systems that resist it. The cult offers both. It provides ritual and language, even as it refuses explanation. This duality mirrors the human mind's relationship to the unknown. We cannot live without confronting mystery, but we also cannot survive total exposure to it. Lovecraft's cults resolve the tension by ritualizing ambiguity. They make the ungraspable into something that can be performed. Consider how this mirrors real-world behavior. When faced with overwhelming phenomena, whether ecological collapse, economic instability, or political chaos, people often retreat into symbolic action, repeating phrases, reenacting myths, seeking hidden orders. These are not mistakes, they are instincts. The cult, in this sense, is not a deviation from reason. It is reason's response to failure. Philosophically, Lovecraft's cults confront us with a question few traditions dare ask. What if knowledge is not empowering? What if its final form is disintegration? In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator warns that the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality. The implication is clear. Knowledge is not always good. Some truths cannot be integrated. The cultist knows this and continues anyway. That is the most haunting function of these cults. They do not offer safety. They offer continuity. In a universe ruled by entropy, they persist through repetition. The chant survives. The symbol returns. The ritual endures even after its purpose is lost. This suggests a kind of horror beyond death, a horror of infinite endurance without meaning. And yet, that is also their victory. We must end where Lovecraft often refused to, with the reader, the viewer, the witness. His stories leave us not with closure, but with residue, a name that cannot be pronounced, a ritual we recognize without explanation, a chant we do not believe but cannot forget. The cult lives not in the text, but in the tension it leaves behind. Because once you've glimpsed a structure that doesn't care about you, you never stop asking, what if it's still there?